Swanns starting at 1:29. At home they wondered if they still ought to send me to have dinner with Monsieur le Commandant even so, but my grandmother refused to believe he had been impolite. Even you admit that he goes about dressed in very simple clothes, hardly those of a man of high society. She declared that in any case, at the very worst, if he had been, it was better to appear not to have noticed. In fact, my father himself, though he was one of the most irritated by the Grandin's attitude, may still have harbored a last doubt as to what it meant. It was like any attitude or action that reveals a person's deep and hidden character, has no connection with anything he has said before. We cannot seek confirmation from the culprit's testimony, for he will not confess. We are reduced to the testimony of our own senses concerning which we wonder, confronting this isolated and incoherent memory, if they were not the victims of an illusion, so that these attitudes, the only ones of any importance, often leave us with some doubts. I had dinner with the Grandin on his terrace. The moon was shining. "This silence has a nice quality, does it not?" he said to me. "For wounded hearts such as mine, a novelist whom you will read later asserts that the only fit companions are shadow and silence. And you know, my child, in life there comes a time, still quite remote for you, when our weary eyes can tolerate only one light, that which a lovely night like this prepares and distills from the darkness, when our ears cannot listen to any other music but that which is played by the moonlight on the flute of silence." I was listening to Monsieur le Grandin's words, which always seemed to me so pleasant, but disturbed by the memory of a woman I had seen recently for the first time, and thinking, now that I knew le Grandin was friends with several of the prominent local aristocracy, that perhaps he knew this one. Plucking up my courage, I said to him, "Monsieur, do you know the ladies of Guermantes?" Happy, too, that in pronouncing this name I was assuming a sort of power over it, by the mere fact of bringing it out of my daydream and giving it an objective existence in the world of sound. But at the name of Guermantes, I saw a little brown notch appear in the center of our friend's blue eyes, as if they had been stabbed by invisible pinpoints, while the rest of the pupils reacted by secreting floods of azure. The arc of his eyelids darkened and drooped, and his mouth, marked by a bitter fold, but recovering more quickly, smiled while his eyes remained sorrowful, like the eyes of a handsome martyr whose body bristles with arrows. "No, I don't know them," he said, but instead of giving so simple a piece of information, so unsurprising an answer in the natural everyday tone that would have been appropriate, he declaimed it, stressing each word, leaning forward, nodding his head with the insistence one imparts, so as to be believed, to an improbable statement, as though the fact that he did not know the Guermantes could be due only to a curious accident of fate, and also with the expressive force of a person who, unable to keep silent about a situation that is painful to him, prefers to proclaim it so as to give others the idea that the confession he is making is one that causes him no embarrassment, is easy, pleasant, spontaneous, that the situation itself, the absence of relations with the Guermantes, could well have been not suffered but desired by him, could result from some family tradition, moral principle, or mystical vow specifically forbidding him any association with the Guermantes. "No," he went on, explaining in his own intonation by what he said. "No, I don't know them. I've never wanted to. I've never made it a point of safeguarding my complete independence. Deep down, I'm a Jacobin in my thinking. You know, many people have tried to save me. They told me I was wrong not to go to the Guermantes, that I was making myself look like a savage, an old bear. But that's not the sort of reputation that dismays me. It's so very true. Deep down, I care for nothing in the world now but a few churches, 2 or 3 books, scarcely more paintings, and the light of the moon when the breeze of your youth brings me the fragrance of the flower beds that my old eyes can no longer distinguish. I did not understand very clearly why, in order to not go to the houses of people one did not know, it was necessary to cling to one's independence, or how this might make one look like a savage or a bear. But what I did understand was that Le Grandin was not being completely truthful when he said he cared only for churches, moonlight, and youth. He cared very much for the people from the chateau, and in their presence was overcome by so great a fear of displeasing them that he did not dare let them see that some of his friends were bourgeois people, sons of notaries or stockbrokers, preferring, if the truth was so to be revealed, that it be revealed in his absence, far away from him, and by default. He was a snob. Certainly he never said any of this in the language my family and I loved so much, and if I asked, "Do you know the Gourmands, Le Grandin, the talker would answer, "No, I have never wanted to know them." Unfortunately, he was not the first Le Grandin to answer, but the second, because another Le Grandin, whom he kept carefully concealed deep inside himself, whom he did not exhibit because that Le Grandin knew some compromising stories about his snobbishness, had already answered by the wound in his eyes, by the rictus of his mouth, by the excessive gravity in the tone of his answer, by the 1,000 arrows with which our own Le Grandin had instantly been larded, languishing like a Saint Sebastian of snobbishness. Alas, how you hurt me! No, I don't know. The Gourmands did not reawaken a great sorrow of my life. And since this troublemaker Le Grandin, this blackmailer Le Grandin, though he did not have the other's pretty language, had the infinitely quicker speech consisting of what are called reflexes. When Le Grandin the talker wished to impose silence on him, the other had already spoken, and though our friend might grieve over the poor impression that his alter ego's revelations must have produced, he could only attempt to mitigate it. This certainly does not mean that Monsieur Le Grandin was not sincere when he ranted against snobs. He could not be aware, at least from his own knowledge, that he was one, since we are familiar only with the passions of others, and what we come to know about our own. We have been able to learn only from them. Upon ourselves they act only secondarily by way of our imagination, which substitutes for our primary motives alternative motives that are more seemly. It was never Le Grandin's snobbishness that advised him to pay frequent visits to a duchess. It would instruct Le Grandin's imagination to make that duchess appear to him as being endowed with all the graces. Le Grandin would become acquainted with the duchess, filled with esteem for himself because he was yielding to attractions of wit and virtue unknown to vile snobs. Only other people were aware that he was one himself. For, because they were incapable of understanding the intermediary work of his imagination, they saw, coupled together, Le Grandin's social activity and its primary cause. Now, we at home no longer had any illusions about Monsieur Le Grandin, and our contacts with him became less frequent. Mamma was infinitely amused each time she caught Le Grandin in flagrant delicto. Speaking. In the sin that he would not confess. But he continued to call a sin without forgiveness snobbishness. My father, on the other hand, had trouble accepting Le Grandin's manifestations of disdain with such detachment and good humor, and when one year the thought of sending me to spend my summer vacation at Balbec with my grandmother, he said, "I absolutely must let Le Grandin know that you'll be going to Balbec, to see if he offers to put you in touch with his sister. He probably doesn't remember telling us she lives only a mile from there." My grandmother, who believed that when staying at a seaside resort, one should be on the beach from morning to evening inhaling the salt, and that one ought not to know anyone thereabouts because visits and excursions were only so much time taken away from the sea air, asked on the contrary that we not speak about our plan to Monsieur Le Grandin, as she could already see his sister Madame de Compremière arriving at the hotel just as when we were about to go fishing and forcing us to remain confined indoors entertaining her. But maman laughed at her fears, thinking privately that the danger was not so great, that Le Grandin would not be in such a hurry to put us in touch with his sister. Yet no one had to mention Balbec to him. It was Le Grandin who, never suspecting that we had any intention of going to those parts, walked into the trap of his own accord one evening when we met him on the banks of the Vivonne. "There are very lovely violets and blues in the clouds this evening, are there not, my friend?" he said to my father. "A blue especially more flowered than airy, the blue of Cinerea, which is surprising in the sky. And that little pink cloud, too, has it not the tint of some flower, a sweet william or hydrangea? Nowhere, perhaps, but on the Channel, between Normandy and Brittany, have I made richer observations of this sort of plant kingdom of the atmosphere. There, near Balbec, near those wild areas, there is a little bay, charmingly gentle, where the sunsets of the country, the red and the gold sunsets, which I do not in the least disdain, let it be said, are characterless, insignificant, but in that damp and mild atmosphere in the evening, you will see blooming in the space of a few instants celestial bouquets of blue and pink, which are incomparable and often last for hours before they fade. There are others that lose their blossoms immediately, and then it is even lovelier to see the entire sky strewn with the scatterings of their countless petals, sulphur or pink. In this bay, which they call Opal Bay, the golden beaches seem gentler still because they are chained like blonde Andromedas to those terrible rocks of the nearby coast, to that gloomy shore fated for the number of its wrecks, where every winter many a vessel is lost to the perils of the sea. Balbec, the most ancient geological skeleton of our soil, truly amour, the sea, the land's end, the accursed region which Anatole France, an enchanter, whom our little friend here ought to read, has painted so well under its eternal fogs, like the veritable country of the Cimmerians in the Odyssey. From Balbec especially, where they are already building hotels, superimposing them upon the ancient and charming soil which they cannot change, what a delight it is to go for excursions just a step or two away through regions so primitive and so lovely. "Oh, do you know someone in Balbec?" asked my father. "As it happens, this boy of ours will be spending 2 months there with his grandmother and my wife, perhaps 2. Legendrine, caught unprepared by this question at a moment when he was looking directly at my father, could not turn his eyes away, but fastening them more intensely by the second, and at the same time smiling sadly to the eyes of his questioner with an expression of friendliness and frankness, and of not being afraid to look him full in the face. He seemed to have gone right through that face as though it had become transparent, and to be seeing at that moment far beyond and behind it a bright and colorful cloud that created a mental alibi for him and would allow him to prove that at the moment when he had been asked if he knew someone at Belbeck, he was thinking of someone else and had not heard the question. Usually such an expression makes the other person say, "What are you thinking about?" But my father, curious, irritated, and cruel, said again, "You know Belbeck so well. Do you have friends in the area?" In a last desperate effort, Le Grandine's smiling gaze reached its highest point of tenderness, vagueness, sincerity, and distraction, but no doubt thinking there was nothing else he could do but answer, said to us this: "I have friends wherever there are companies of trees, wounded but not vanquished, which huddle together with touching obstinacy to implore an inclement and pitiless sky." "That's not what I meant," said my father, "and as obstinate as the trees and the pitiless sky. In case something should happen to my mother-in-law, and she needed to feel she was not all alone in the out-of-the-way place, I was asking if you knew anyone there." "There, as everywhere, I know everyone, and I know no one," answered Le Chantrine, who was not going to give in so quickly. "I know a great deal about things and very little about people. But in that place, the very things themselves seem to be people, rare people, delicate in their very essence, disappointed by life. Sometimes it's a manor house that you encounter on a cliff, by the side of the road where it has stopped to point its sorrow towards the still pink evening, where the golden moon rises while the returning boats fluting the dappled water hoist the flame of evening on their mast and carry its colors. Sometimes it's a simple solitary house, rather ugly, its expression shy but romantic, which conceals from all eyes some imperishable secret of happiness and disenchantment. That land which is so lacking in truth," he added with a Machiavellian delicacy, "that land of pure fiction makes poor reading for a child, and is certainly not what I would choose and recommend for my little friend, already so inclined to sadness, for his heart already so predisposed. Climates of amorous confessions and vain regrets may suit a disillusioned old man like me, but they are unhealthy for one whose temperament is not yet formed. Please believe me," he went on insistently. "The waters of that bay already have Breton, may act as a sedative, though a questionable one, on a heart like mine that is no longer undamaged, on a heart for whose wounds there is no longer any compensation. They are contraindicated. Never heard that word before. They are contraindicated. At your age, my boy, good night, Mayverse," he said, leaving us with that evasive abruptness which was his habit, and turning back toward us with a doctor's raised finger, he summed up his advice: "No Belbeck before the age of 50, and even then it must depend on the state of heart." He called to us, although my father talked to him about this again in our subsequent encounters, torturing him with questions. It was useless. Like that erudite crook who used to employ in fabricating false palimpsests a labor and a scholarship, 100th part of which would have been enough to guarantee him a more lucrative but honorable position. Monsieur le Grandin, had we insisted further, would have ended by constructing a whole system of landscape ethics and a celestial geography of Lower Normandy sooner than he would admit to us that his own sister lived a mile from Balbec, and be obliged to offer us a letter of introduction, which would not have been such an object of terror for him had he been absolutely certain, as in fact he should have been given his experience of my grandmother's character, that we would not have taken advantage of it. We always returned in good time from our walks so that we could pay a visit to my Aunt Leonie before our dinner. At the beginning of the season, when the days ended early, when we reached the Rue de Saint-Esprit, there was still a reflection of the sunset on the window panes of the house, and a brand of crimson deep in the timbers of the Calvary, which was reflected further off in the pool, a red which, often accompanied by a rather brisk chill, was associated in my mind with the red of the fire over which was roasting the chicken that would allow the poetic pleasure given me by the walk to be succeeded by the pleasure of gluttony, warmth, and rest. But in the summer when we returned, the sun was not yet setting, and during the visit we made to my Aunt Leonie, its light, lowering and touching the window, had stopped between the great curtains and the curtain loops, divided, ramified, filtered, and encrusting the lemon wood of the chest and drawers with little pieces of gold, illuminated the room obliquely with the delicacy it acquires in the forest undergrowth. But on certain very rare days, when we returned, the chest had lost its momentary incrustations long before. When we reached the Rue de Saint-Esprit, there was no reflection of the sunset spread over the window panes, and the pool at the front of the Calvary had lost its red. Sometimes it was already the color of opal, and a long ray of moonlight that grew broader and broke over the wrinkles of the water traversed it entirely. Then as we came near the house, we would see a figure on the doorstep, and Mamma would say to me, "Dear me, there's Francois watching for us. Your aunts must be worried. That means we're late." And without taking the time to remove our things, we would go quickly up to my Aunt Leonie's room to reassure her and show her that, contrary to what she already was imagining, nothing had happened to us, but that we had gone the Guermantes way. And bless us, when we took that walk, my aunt knew very well one could never be sure what time would come back. "There, Francois," said my aunt, "what did I tell you? Didn't I say they must have gone the Guermantes way? Heavens, how hungry they must be. And your leg of lamb all dried up after waiting so long. Was it time to be getting back? Well, imagine that you went the Guermantes way." "And I thought you knew, Leonie," said Mamma. "I thought Francois saw us go out the little gate from the kitchen garden." For the environments of Cambrai, there were two ways which one could go for a walk, in such opposite directions that in fact we left our houses by different doors when we wanted to go one way or the other. The Méséglise-les-Vignes way, which we also called the way by Swanns because we passed right in front of Swanns' estate when we went in that direction, and the Guermantes way. About Méséglise-les-Vignes, to tell the truth, I never knew anything but the way, and some strangers who used to come and stroll around Combray on a Sunday, people whom at this time, even my aunt, along with the rest of us, did not know at all, and whom because of this we assumed to be people who must have come from Méséglise. As for Guermantes, I was to know more about it one day, but only much later, and during the whole of my adolescence, if for me Méséglise was something as inaccessible as the horizon, concealed from view, however far we went, by the folds of a landscape that already no longer resembled the landscape of Combray, Guermantes, on the other hand, appeared to me only as the terminus, more ideal than real, of its own way, a sort of abstract geographical expression, like the line of the equator, like a pole, like the Orient. So, to set off toward Guermantes, in order to go to Méséglise, or the opposite, would have seemed to me an expression as devoid of meaning as to set off toward the east in order to go west. Since my father always liked talking about Méséglise, Since my father always talked about the Méséglise way as the most beautiful view of the plain that he knew about, and about the Guermantes ways, a typical river landscape, I gave them, conceiving of them thus as two entities, the cohesion, the unity that belongs only to creations of our minds. The smallest part of either of them seemed to me precious and to manifest their particular excellence. While compared to them, before one reached the sacred ground of one or the other, the purely material paths in the midst of which they are set down as the ideal view of the plain and the ideal river landscape were no more worth the trouble of looking at than, for the spectator, infatuated with the art of drama, the little streets next to a theater. But most importantly, I set between them, much more than their distances in miles, the distance that lay between the two parts of my brain where I thought about them. One of those distances of the mind which not only moves things away from each other, but separates them and puts them on different planes, and that demarcation was made even more absolute because of our habits of never going both ways on the same day, in a single walk, but one time the Méséglise way, one time the Guermantes way, shut them off, so to speak, far apart from each other, unknowable by each other, in the sealed and uncommunicating vessels of different afternoons. When we wanted to go in the direction of Méséglise, we would go out, not too early, and even if the sky was overcast, because the walk was not very long and did not take us too far away, as though we were going anywhere at all, through the front door of my aunt's house, on the Rue du Saint-Esprit. We would be greeted by the gunsmith, we would drop our letters in the box, we would tell Theodore from Francois as we passed that she had no more oil or coffee, and we would leave town by the lane that ran along the white gate of Monsieur Swanns' park. Before reaching it, we would meet the smell of his lilacs coming out to greet strangers. From among the fresh green little hearts of their leaves, the flowers would curiously lift above the gate of the park their tufts of mauve or white feathers, glazed even in the shade by the sun in which they had bathed. A few half hidden by the little tiled lodge called the Archer's House, where the caregivers lived, overtopped its Catholic gable with their pink minarets. The nymphs of spring would have seemed vulgar compared to these young houris, which preserved within this French garden the pure and vivid tones of Persian miniatures. Despite my desire to entwine their supple waists and draw down to me the starry curls of their fragrant heads, we would pass by without stopping because my parents had ceased to visit Tansonville since Swanns' marriage, and so as not to appear to be looking into the park instead of taking the lane that goes along the fence and climbs directly up to the fields, we would take another that leads to the same place but obliquely, and that brought us out too far away. One day my grandfather said to me, "Don't you remember Swanns telling us yesterday that his wife and daughter were going off to Reims, and that he would take the opportunity to spend the day in Paris? We could go along by the park since the ladies aren't there. It would make the walk that much shorter for us." We stopped for a moment in front of the gate. Lilac time was nearly over. A few still poured forth in tall mauve chandeliers, the delicate bubbles of their flowers, but in many places along the leaves, where only a week before they had still been breaking in waves of fragrant foam, a hollow scum now withered, shrunken, and dark, dry, and odorless. My grandfather pointed out to my father how the look of the place had remained the same, and how it had changed since the